So in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, marched against Jerusalem with his whole army. He encamped outside the city and built siege works all around it. The city was kept under siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. By the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine in the city had become so severe that there was no food for the people to eat. Then the city wall was broken through, and the whole army fled at night through the gate between the two walls near the king's garden, though the Babylonians were surrounding the city. They fled toward Arabah, but the Babylonian army pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho. All his soldiers were separated from him and scattered, and he was captured. He was taken to the king of Babylon at Riblah, where sentence was pronounced on him. They killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. Then they put out his eyes, bound him with bronze shackles, and took him to Babylon. On the 7th day of the 5th month, in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard, an official of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. The whole Babylonian army, under the commander of the imperial guard, broke down the walls around Jerusalem. Nebuzaradan, the commander of the guard, carried into exile the people who remained in the city, along with the rest of the populace and those who had deserted to the king of Babylon. But the commander left behind some of the poorest people of the land to work the vineyards and the fields. So when I was 9, along with my family, I was fortunate to visit Israel. And I don't remember every historical detail from seeing the sites that I suppose I would if I had seen it as an adult. But I do remember the feelings that the places would stir up in me. I remember Lazarus' tomb. I remember the Garden of Gethsemane. I remember the Sea of Galilee. All caused me to feel this sort of unique sense of like the Lord's leftovers lingering in these places. But there was one place in particular that I remember being quite impactful even at that age, and that was the Wailing Wall. So the Wailing Wall is the remnant of the second temple. So there were 2 temples. The first temple, which we just read about being burnt down, then after the exiles come back, they built it again. So this is the second temple, and there's this section of it that remains in Jerusalem. And it is referred to as the Wailing Wall. And they call it the Wailing Wall because to this day, the faithful gather there where they slip prayers into the cracks of the wall and they wail. And in Judaism, often when they pray, they do this type of emotion. And so there's just like tons of men doing this and putting their prayers into the wall and mourning and agonizing and renewing hope. And it's just this symbol of like faith, but also this symbol of almost spiritual desolation, and yet this desperation to renew hope again. It's a symbol of a long history of this nation rising and falling, yes, politically, yes, even geographically, but especially spiritually. And the fall of Jerusalem, as we read about here in 2 Kings, then, was not just another military conquest, which we read about often at this time period and even in the Bible. It was a spiritual desolation of the people and the place. God's people were not just physically exiled, but they were in fact cut off from the land where they and their ancestors had worshipped God at this point for generations. And so the destruction of the city and the temple is both for Israel at this point a crisis of identity, and it is a crisis of faith. Exile isn't just about being relocated against our will or our wishes. Exile is something more like a spiritual heart attack in a way. And even worse, the experience of exile can often cause us to feel that God is not just the object of our worship or our creator, but has even now become our adversary, that he's against us. And that was certainly the way the prophet Jeremiah felt as he processed everything that was happening around him. So look at this firsthand description of Jeremiah, this chosen prophet of God. as he describes the heaviness in his heart. So the city's been destroyed, and here he is, sitting in the rubble, sitting in the ruin, and he says, I am the man who has seen affliction. By the rod of the Lord's wrath, he's driven me away and made me walk in darkness rather than light. Indeed, he's turned his hand against me again and again all day long. He's made my skin and my flesh grow old. He's broken my bones. He has besieged me and surrounded me with bitterness and hardship. He has made me dwell in darkness like those long dead. He has walled me in so I cannot escape. He's weighed me down with chains. Even when I call out or cry for help, he shuts out my prayer. He's barred my way with blocks of stone. He's made my paths crooked. Like a bear lying in wait, like a lion in hiding, he dragged me from the path and mangled me and left me without help. He drew his bow, and he made me the target for his arrows. He pierced my heart with arrows from his quiver. I became the laughing stock of all my people. They mocked me in song all day long. He's filled me with bitter herbs and given me gall to drink. He's broken my teeth with gravel, and he's trampled me in the dust. I've been deprived of peace. I've forgotten what prosperity is. So I say my splendor is gone, and all that I had hoped for from the Lord. Wow. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I will remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. Yet, this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed. Remember, church, the context of this statement. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. That's some real deal stuff. That is real deal stuff. And I think on some level we've all felt like Jeremiah did, not specifically, but I think we felt far from God. I think at times all of us, if we're honest, have felt that he's somehow against us. And I think that when we feel distant from God and we're trapped in struggles, or maybe we're burdened by our sin, we know what it's like in some sense to feel as though we are an exile, living on the outside, living not where we want to be living. But the truth woven throughout the story of God's divine desire for a family is that even in judgment, even in exile, even in consequences, God's purpose is, in fact, always for restoration. So here's our sermon in a sentence for this morning. It's a short one this time. Exile seems like abandonment, but it is God's way of refining his people and drawing them back to him. So how God does this refining and this drawing, we're going to explore here, and we're going to do it specifically by looking at some of the details of the siege and a little bit of the experience of being taken as captives. So our first point is this, that God allows these breaking points to lead us to spiritual renewal. And in some ways, this, in fact, could probably just be the sermon, but we're going to go beyond this. But this is sort of the big idea, that God allows these breaking points to lead us to spiritual renewal. So here's the first 4 verses again. In the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, gives us all these dates. We see that Babylon marched against Jerusalem with his whole army. He encamped outside the city, built siege works all around it. The city was kept under siege until the 11th year. By the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine in the city becomes so severe there's no food. Then the city wall was broken through, and the whole army fled at night through the gate between the 2 walls near the king's garden, though the Babylonians were surrounding the city. So it's hard to imagine what it would have been like to live through this. Jerusalem, the center of Judah's life, the center of their worship, is under siege for 2 straight years. The city of God, the place of presence, a location of safety, a city of blessing, a place of provision, was for 2 long years a place of fear and starvation night and day. And for those of us who've known war only as something that happens far away to other people, it's possible we can't even actually imagine this experience. What it would have been like to be moms and dads with little kids, or parents with elderly parents, as the city is under siege for 2 straight years and you've got nothing to eat and nowhere to go. But again, it doesn't mean we are entirely unfamiliar with the experience of sieges in other ways. We do face sieges. We felt our bodies under siege by disease and attacks or conditions that we are powerless to stop, or in fact, even powerless to figure out what they are. We felt under siege by our spouse, by our parents, even our boss, by their habitual bad moods and bad weeks and bad behaviors. We felt under siege by expectations of others that we can never, ever meet. We've been under siege by fear and addiction. We've been under siege by doubt. And the thing about sieges is that they tend to put enough stress on us that they do lead to breaking points. And then to make matters a little worse, these breaking points can quite often lead people to feel abandoned by God. Even in those simple things like, my marriage is a little bit rocky right now, or I don't know how I'm going to pay the bills, or my boss is really, really, really hard to work with or for. Even in those moments, we can feel abandoned by God. Yet the story of the Bible, and specifically this siege of Jerusalem, reminds us that God often uses these moments to break through our bad theories and our bad practices, our bad inheritances, the bad traumas that we picked up from the house we grew up in that we still try to operate in. And it breaks through those, and it wakes us up to a different sort of dependence on God. But that's a process. For the walls of Jerusalem, it was 2 years. For us, maybe it'll be 2 years, maybe it's longer, maybe it's not as long, I don't know, but it is a process. And sometimes it does get worse before it gets better. And even Jeremiah, God's chosen prophet, experiences this. As we looked at Lamentations 3, he feels as if he's become God's adversary, rather than this faithful mouthpiece to the nation, warning people. He feels now God and him are against each other. And again, we understand Jeremiah's language. I mean, we want to pretend we're pious and we wouldn't do such things, but I think we get it. Because we know often it is a struggle to see God's purpose in struggle and suffering. We can talk about it and we can encourage others, like, oh, God is certainly in it. But often when the rubber meets the road and we find ourselves there, it is not always easy to see God's goodness and purpose and renewal and redemption and restoration and all these things that were promised. And as I said, for Israel, this was a long process of coming to see God's purposes through this. It was a 2-year siege, and then it was a 70-year captivity. Some of them never made it back. They died as captives in Babylon. But that's what God deemed to be long enough for them to come to realize what, in fact, his purposes were, not just for the moment, but for them as a people, for his portion, his Israel. Jeremiah had to sit in the rubble, had to sit in the ruin as part of the process of coming to understand that sometimes God allows the walls around us to collapse so that we will come to, in a new, profound way, understand not just the benefits of God for us, but the beauty of having relationship with him. Lately, I've been challenged and encouraged by a pastor in the United States who went through a similar experience to some of this. This pastor would be a couple years younger than me. I don't think he's 40 yet. He's married. He has 3 little boys. And about a year ago, he was diagnosed with advanced stage cancer in a number of his vital organs in his abdomen. And so immediately, he begins very aggressive cancer treatment and was left to face the possibility that his future on earth was going to be cut short. Today, he is miraculously in remission, and his testimony in a nutshell is that the last year was the hardest year of his life and the most spiritually formative at the same time. He says, both of those are true for me. The hardest year of my life and the most spiritually formative. And I think, there's something that I wanted to warn us against, and even my own mind as I was processing that testimony. We're so used to the cliche of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And you got to tear the muscle to make the muscles bigger. And all these cliches we've come up with about breaking down to become stronger. And so we say them. But the reality is there is something about the breaking, when things break and walls break and temples burn and our sacred cows are melted down, where God begins to refine something in us. The hardest and the most spiritually formative at the same time. And the question that we must answer then, whenever we're facing these types of sieges, is, will this lead me away from God? Or will this lead me back towards Him? There's often not a middle position. And the incredible promise of the God who is over all is He does not allow, and hear me, church, He does not allow our suffering to be meaningless. Ever. He always invites us into renewal through what we suffer. It's never meaningless. Ever. So that's the broad idea of refinement through breaking. Now we're going to look at some of the specifics of that. So we can say this, we see this very clearly in this story, that sin will blind us, but God even uses those consequences to bring clarity. So Babylonian army pursues the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho. All his soldiers are separated from him and scattered, and he's captured. And he's taken to the king of Babylon at Riblah, where he has a sentence pronounced on him. And then they do something that's pretty graphic and pretty horrible. They kill his sons in front of him, and then they gouge his eyes out. So the last thing he ever sees visibly is the death of his sons, and then it goes dark. So the fall of Jerusalem is brutal, and King Zedekiah's personal story within this bigger narrative is tragic. This is tragic. And why it's tragic is because this guy was repeatedly warned that this was going to happen. This is going to happen. You have to quit worshiping all those gods. You have to quit treating God's people like this, or this is going to happen. And he refused to listen. And so the fruit of his sin and his arrogance is that he's forced to watch his own son's execution. And then those same eyes are taken from him. And in this stirring sort of living analogy, God was pretty gnarly with his analogies in the Old Testament. Zedekiah's physical blindness comes to reflect his spiritual blindness. He becomes the physical example of what the prophet Isaiah was saying when he said, they see but they don't perceive. Zedekiah had relied on position and on comfort and on self-reliance and ultimately doing whatever he wanted, only to come to realize that he was entirely wrong because he never perceived, even though he saw. The way that he saw his authority and the worship of God and the treatment of God's people was wrong. And so God allowed the Babylonians to take away his sight. And dear church, I know that, again, for our 21st century Western ears, this story is hard to hear. I know it's even hard to believe that God would allow things like this to happen. But we talked about this last week, and I'll just double down. God does allow us to experience consequences for spiritual blindness. God does ultimately give us what we tell him we want. Read Romans 1. And God gave them over. They wanted it bad enough, God said, fine, have it. But the good news is that God's mercy is such that it is never intended as a final punishment. Consequences are not a final punishment. They are intended, when God is in them, to always bring clarity for the sake of restoration. Jeremiah, this character who's living in it, describes the agonizing experience of feeling left in the darkness also, and living in a moment in which his prayers felt as though they were imprisoned. He has made me dwell in darkness. like those long dead. He's walled me in so I cannot escape, and he's weighed me down with chains. Even when I call out or cry for help, he shuts out my prayer. That's heavy, but that wasn't the final word. And for Jeremiah, for Israel, even for us, Jeremiah's feelings are never, ever, ever the final judgment. Even in these moments of consequence, even in these moments of darkness, God is, even in these words, actually working to rescue and to one day restore his people. God was even in this, though it seemed he wasn't. He was actually using the worst thing Israel could imagine to bring new life. He was using blindness to bring clarity. He was using darkness to bring light. And if you're still unconvinced that God would do this, remember this then, that if you are a follower of Jesus, this has already been your story. Christ entered our exile. He took our blindness, and he opened our eyes to see the truth. Jesus, in fact, said of himself, right in his hometown synagogue, that he came to give sight to the blind. In him, we who were once blind, who were seeing but not perceiving, we can now see. And so God doesn't abandon people to their blindness. Rather, he uses the blindness to bring true clarity and draw people to himself. Next, the siege and exile show that destruction is painful, but God uses destruction even to purify. On the 7th day of the 5th month in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard and official of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. This guy kind of just does all the dirty work. He sets fire to the temple, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. The whole Babylonian army under the commander of the imperial guard broke down the walls around Jerusalem. So the temple, the heart of Jewish worship, is destroyed. Specifically, it is burnt to the ground. As we read the royal palace and all of the people's homes. Now, the palace and the homes are one thing. I mean, whatever. They don't have as much significance as the temple does. The temple, losing that is a massive, massive blow to the nation of Israel. And I don't know that we can really comprehend how significant this was to them. Because for us, Christianity, for better at times, but also for a lot of worse at times, has reduced the worship building, the church, the local, street corner place of worship, to something unnecessary. I can just worship at home, many of our friends and family proudly say. That would have been a preposterous statement at the time of the temple. And the priest would have said, actually, no, you can't. You can't. You actually have to do these things here with me. Now, have things changed? Of course. Where 2 or 3 are gathered, is Jesus there? Yes, I know all of that. My point is just to contrast the value of the temple to the value we place on where we worship. The temple was the central place for ancient Judaism to worship Yahweh. It symbolized God's presence amongst his people. It housed the Ark of the Covenant. It housed the covenantal documents of God saying, you're my people and I'm your God. It had the Holy of Holies where God's presence dwelt, and only one guy once a year could hang out in that place. It was the place where God's glory was believed to dwell. And the temple served as this focal point for sacrifices and festivals and communal worship, and it reinforced every time they gathered this covenant relationship that God had made to them. And so then its destruction by the Babylonians isn't just a little problem, like, oh, well, we'll worship at home on Zoom or whatever. We have our favorite priest that we watch on YouTube. I listen to podcasts. It marked a profound and spiritual national crisis. As it burnt, so did the Jewish identity. So did their theology. So did their hopes for restoration. Who are we now? Where is God? Literally, where is God now? But the truth is that this fire both destroyed, but it also purified. So Malachi 3 describes God as a refiner's fire. A refiner's fire, not just fire, a refiner's fire, purifying his people. And so though the destruction of the temple was a serious problem, it was a consequence, it was an experience of profound heartache, the bigger truth still is that God is purifying his people. He's purifying his portion. He's purifying their identity. He's purifying their worship. He's purifying their security. They don't necessarily understand that just yet, but that is what God is doing in this. God was helping his people, his portion, to recover a view of life that understood, I'm always with you. I am the cloud, and I am the pillar of smoke. I am the God who has walked with you in the wilderness. I am the one who appeared to Moses in the burning bush. I am that guy. Wherever you go, I will be with you. I will not leave you or forsake you, declares the Lord. They were being reminded of that. They were recovering a view of worship that was marked by faithfulness to God, not just all of the right sacrifices and all of the right external appearances, as valuable as those were. He was purifying their hearts. These hearts that were stone, and he was saying, I'll make them flesh. I'll make them soft again. He was giving them a new sense of security that was not dependent on having walls and even a temple, but a sense of security that was built on his power and his wisdom and his covenant faithfulness to them. In a way, God was answering a question that Israel didn't even know it needed to ask. And I think that question was, what would our lives and our nation be without the land, walls, or the temple? Who are we then? And that's good. It's good to even ask the question and answer it right now amongst yourselves. Who are we when everything we deem to be essential is lost? Who are we then? And maybe God's asking you to consider that question. What are you and who are you? If something you have deemed to be absolutely essential for you or your children, your lifestyle or whatever it is taken, who are you then? But the promise for us is the same as it was for Israel. That fire to Israel's essentials was not the end of God's work. It was a purification of who they were and how they worshiped. Finally, exile is not the end. God's promise is always restoration. Nebuzaradan, the commander of the guard, carried into exile the people who remained in the city, along with the rest of the populace and those who had deserted the king of Babylon. But the commander of the guard left behind some of the poorest people of the land to work the vineyards and the fields. So the destruction of the first temple and the exile of Israel to Babylon was a devastating moment for Israel. We understand that they would have felt everything God had promised, the land, his covenant, the temple where his eyes would be on it night and day, that his dwelling place with them, that it was lost. Maybe they'd heard wrong. And in addition to all those comforts and all those cultures, they would have felt that their very existence as Israel was gone forever. We're Babylonians now, I guess. Where do we go? We don't have land. We don't have a temple. We don't have a king. He doesn't have any eyes. But this passage highlights an important truth that exile, as painful as it was not total annihilation. Even in judgment, God preserves a remnant. I love that the poorest of the land were left behind. To this commander, he's going, well, let's leave the scraps. We don't really need them. They're not going to benefit us. I don't even want them in Babylon. So we'll leave the poorest here to just work some of these vineyards, bring us our wine. And meanwhile, God's going, nah, I'm just going to keep a little remnant right there in the land that I said would always be for me and my people. And so even in judgment, God's preserving a remnant. The poorest occupying still. The exile was not the final word. God had not, in fact, abandoned his people. The land was still occupied. And for those who were far from home, God spoke some very famous words. Through this prophet Jeremiah, God made his intentions very clear to Israel. For I know the plans I have for you. Good, because we were starting to feel like you didn't have any. And the ones you had, are brutal. I know I have the plans for you. You might not, but I do. I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. Every graduate from a Christian family was given this promise, almost as if it was a reward for diligence and hard work in high school. Dear graduate, is not the context of Jeremiah's words. The context was a brutal and bloody exile. The context was a small remnant of poor left to live in the ruins and to try to survive. It was given to a community that had been dragged away as captives. There were no cap and gowns. There was no promise of be anything you want to be if you just work hard. The declaration of the Lord was spoken to failures, not valedictorians. The declaration of the Lord was spoken to people who weren't on their way to promising careers because they were good at math or because they'd done well in history. These words were written to prisoners, captives, people without a nation, without a home, and without a temple. And it was assuring them that God's plan was still unfolding. Though they were far from home, they were not far from his purpose. And though they were far from life as they had known it, they were not far from his presence. Though they had no answers, God did. And there was still future and there was still hope. N.T. Wright says really plainly about this whole ordeal. Something that I think it colors it well. He says, Israel goes into exile in order to be reshaped by God. Where, in other words, the potter remolds the clay. That's what was going on. Now, if Israel determines that they are their own and they have no God and they just get to do as they do and be in charge of their own kingdoms, then the potter, doesn't have a right to remold the clay, but he made them. They're his. He chose them. They're his portion. He designed them. They bear his image. He called them. He's been with them. They are his. And so he takes them into exile and he reshapes them, refines them, reforms them. And it was during that time that Israel deepens its understanding of God, shifting from a temple-centered worship to a faith that could endure beyond the land of promise and the temple of presence. They figured out how to do it. God's promise of restoration wasn't just about returning to Jerusalem, but about renewing his relationship with them. And that, church, is really a beautiful and essential lesson. God is less interested in restoring life to exactly what it was for us. I think that that's one of maybe the great delusions of humanity, is that we're constantly trying to get back to the Garden of Eden. God doesn't ever restore it back to the Garden of Eden. He restores it to something like the Garden of Eden, but we're not going back to the Garden of Eden, ever. He's less interested in restoring life to exactly what it was. Sometimes we lose things and God doesn't bring them back. Sometimes he does, but sometimes he doesn't. But what God is always doing is working on restoring the relationship with him and his family. That is priority one, not our stuff, not our dream. Him and that relationship. Because that has always been his desire for us. That's why we exist, for him. So here's your summit in a sentence one more time. Exile seems like abandonment, but it is God's way of refining his people and drawing them back to him. Exile does feel like abandonment. Feels like devastation. It sounds like lament. But as Jeremiah reminds us, it's not the end of the story. The people of Jerusalem saw their city reduced to ashes. They sat in the ruins. They wept by the rivers of Babylon. And they wondered if they had been utterly forgotten, if God had become their adversary. But in those darkest moments, God's covenant faithfulness never, ever, ever wavered. He had not abandoned them. He was refining them, shaping them, preparing them for a future where he would gather them back to their land again, but ultimately back to himself. And that same truth holds for us. We all experience these moments, these seasons, these weeks and months and even years where it feels like exile. There are times of loss. There are times of grief. There are times of displacement. There are times where our comforts and our customs are disrupted and maybe even lost. And we wonder, where, oh God, did you go? And if you're there, why are you so against me? But even in those moments, we're not in fact beyond God's reach. The God who brought his people back from exile is the same God who has invited us to now make our home in him through his son, Jesus Christ. You know, God sent Jesus to do something that I don't always think we make these amazing connections to, but he sent Jesus to take on our exile, where we were separated from God. He sent Jesus to take on our exile. He sent Jesus to feel as if the Father had become his adversary. He sent Jesus to face the worst of consequences and the worst of judgment. He sent Jesus to say, why do I feel like I'm in the dark? He sent Jesus to drink the bitter drink. He sent Jesus to have his mouth smashed with gravel, so to speak. He sent Jesus to hear the songs mocking him day and night on our behalf. He sent Jesus to deal with separation from God's presence that was certainly and eternally ours, and to make then a way for our ultimate restoration to righteousness in God's sight. And so when you feel lost, if you feel lost, when life feels like you are living in the ruins, remember, exile might seem like abandonment, but it is God's way of refining you and drawing you back to him. He wants you more than anything else. And the ultimate exile now has been vanquished. And any exile we face now can only be used to refine us and to draw us closer to the God who desires us above all else. Amen.